If we were more sensitive to the ways in which climate change reflects the whole functioning of modern societies, we would perhaps better grasp the opportunities it offers. These points do not mean, of course, that each society should be able to fund all of its adaptation costs from associated co-benefits in a painless way. Far from it. There is no guarantee, even at the global level, that this would balance out, and in the most vulnerable societies, it most certainly will not. Nonetheless, dealing with the cost would be easier if the benefits were counted comprehensively, and the results would also be much more sustainable over the long term. In conclusion, to borrow this morning's joke, but it's true, it is actually the conclusion. This meeting invites us to look back to COP16 in Cancun and to take stock of the very modest and perhaps transient successes achieved there. However, it is perhaps even more important to look forward, not just to COP17 in Durban at the end of this year, but also to the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio de Janeiro in May 2012, 20 years after the conference at which the UNFCCC, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Rio Declaration, and Agenda 21 were adopted. It is not very controversial, I think, to suggest that the deliberate adoption by the international community of a very narrow framing of climate change, which is the logic of the Kyoto Protocol, has not made the issue easier to handle, as was assumed in 1997, but has actually created a fairly severe form of gridlock. Movement towards a more comprehensive agenda, which was actually clearly in evidence even within the UNFCCC process itself in 2010, brings its own dangers, of course, the danger of dilution. The broader the agenda, the less the need to focus on any particular part of it, of distraction. Minor issues might attract all the attention and prevent an adequate response to major issues. And of course, the risk of a purely à la carte approach to action against climate change. Nonetheless, if the arguments I've been sketching in this introductory presentation are even in part correct, broadening the climate change agenda could help address it in the way it demands. If so, adapting to climate change would become just one very important dimension of sustainable development. Not a one-off problem to be solved, but an ongoing, never-finished challenge. Not simply a cost to be borne, but a stepping stone towards a more human world. Thank you.
I would like to ask to Dr. Crowley, because for us, the small island states and the developing countries, of course, adaptations is a main issue. But what happened with mitigation? Because, of course, all these things have impacts, in social impacts, impacts in the human being, and all related with the problem of the ethics and values. But we have a lot of things to do in mitigation, because we can do many things also in adaptation right now, with the problem that we have right now. But what would happen if it continues? And if it is a reality of the 2 degrees that is at this moment expected if we don't finish the emissions of these gases. So I think that it's very important for us. For example, we are doing a lot of things in the Caribbean. Tomorrow I will explain what we are doing in our country and in the Caribbean. But I think that we cannot forget the problem of the mitigation that was very strongly expressed in Rio in 1992. That's why we have the convention. And we have the protocol of Kyoto. But after that, what happens? What is happening? And it's not only at this moment the problem of the effects, but we have problem in the ocean, acidification, the sea level. So, and the hydrometeorological events, they are more strong. So, I think that we have to find when we talk a little bit about solidarity, the responsibility that each of us has in all this process. that was also very clear expressed in the principles in Rio. Now we are preparing our agenda, Cuba agenda for Rio, and we are seeing what happened all these 20 years, and actually have happened very, very few for us, the poor people, the small island states. So we have to found, yes, I know, a new agenda seems to reflect in different way, but we cannot forget the main original things that create all these problems. I would like to know how you manage.
You want to comment?
Yes, certainly. Mitigation is less significant for UNESCO because of the range of UNESCO's competences. The international community, as you know, has desired to make discussions on binding legal agreements with respect to mitigation the exclusive province of the UNFCCC negotiating process. UNESCO has no role in that. So this isn't an issue for UNESCO's activities. However, I fully agree with you that in the absence of serious efforts to ensure mitigation, many of the positive things I said about adaptation would become largely irrelevant. And indeed, the situation is worse even than you indicated, because 2 degrees centigrade temperature rise over pre-industrial levels, or even over some more recent benchmark, is a convenient reference point for supposedly non-dangerous climate change. It is not what's likely to happen on the basis of current commitments. The inventory of current commitments made under the Copenhagen Accord points to a likely temperature rise in a median scenario of more like 3.5 degrees, unless more serious commitments are made. Now, what I suggested in my paper as a point of analysis is that one of the reasons why the Kyoto Protocol has not been effectively implemented is because it was poorly designed from the start. Not simply because of lack of political will. It was poorly designed because it reduced the problem of climate change to the problem of greenhouse gas emissions. It then reduced the problem of greenhouse gas emissions almost exclusively to carbon dioxide, and then reduced the problem of carbon dioxide almost exclusively to carbon pricing. A kind of funnel approach, which meant that a very big, complex problem was reduced to a small, supposedly manageable problem. It didn't work. And there were very good reasons why it didn't work, because the problem as thus defined was not simplified, it was transformed. And the idea that simply by setting a carbon price, one would automatically put market forces at work to find the most effective solutions sounded wrong in 1995 at the Berlin COP that adopted the road to Kyoto, and sounds ridiculous today. So that it isn't simply a matter of wanting to achieve certain outcomes, it's also a matter of institutional architecture. And as an analyst of the process, long before even being part of UNESCO, my impression is that rethinking the institutional architecture is important. But the purpose of rethinking it is not to shift from mitigation to adaptation. It is to make sure that the international climate change regime walks on its 2 legs. And mitigation needs to proceed through a combination of unilateral national policies adopted largely on a co-benefits basis and binding multilateral commitments. We need both, and at this stage, on the whole, we have neither. So I entirely agree with you.
Yeah, my intervention essentially deals with a real practical situation in addressing the issues of climate change. Now, from the way the discussions have been unfolding, it is clear that market solutions are being presented as the principal approaches and solutions in addressing the issue of climate change. And for many small economies, particularly ours in the Caribbean, are essentially inhibited because of our size and also the structure of our economies. And as such, policymakers do not have the flexibility with regards to the available instruments to use to address the many nuances of climate change. For us in the region, climate change is one of survival. And if we look at all the scientific information, what it has been pointing is that our region may not be the same region, perhaps, in the time frame that the global discussions are proceeding. And the question here, in terms of ethical considerations, are what provisions are essentially required to address our concerns. From our standpoint, we have been innovative in terms of trying to pool our approach to address the various nuances with regards to climate change. In terms of adaptation, I think one of the important elements with regards to our approach is that our region have adopted an approach which the UNFCCC have more or less tailored to address most developing countries with regards to adaptation. However, the fundamental challenge that small countries face, among other developing countries, is that there's an apparent shift in the global approach towards adaptation by way of trying to disaggregate adaptation approaches from mitigation approaches. And there's some real fundamental challenges here with regards to the entire approach in terms of dealing with adaptation. And this signal is very explicit and clear with regards to even the fast-track financing and all the various modes of financing where most of the resources are going towards mitigation. And on the other hand, we find in difficulty with regards to the allocation of resources for adaptation. So, in light of this scenario, and in terms of the ethics, what principles perhaps might be helpful in terms of addressing this scenario? Thank you very much.
Very hard question.
A very hard question. First of all, just to emphasize that separating mitigation from adaptation and making adaptation an alternative to mitigation are two mistakes. They make no sense conceptually, and I suspect that they make no sense practically either. It is combining the two perspectives that offers possible solutions. With regard to ethical principles that might bear on these debates, I think it might be more appropriate to have the discussion following the presentation by Dr. Vossouri on behalf of COMEST, because these are rather complex areas. Let me just take one example to illustrate the complexity and the need for this to be a discussion about ethics, not simply the application of ethical principles. The United Nations Framework Convention states that states parties have common but differentiated responsibilities. Common because we all share the planet, differentiated because we have different historical responsibilities, different degrees of vulnerability, and different capacities to act. But how exactly should responsibilities be differentiated? That's an open question. It's an ethical discussion, it's also a practical, policy-relevant discussion, and it isn't foreclosed by general ethical principles. It is very clear that other things being equal, those who have made the greatest contribution to cumulative historical emissions and those who have the greatest capacity to act should do the most on the basis of differentiated responsibilities combined with solidarity. But, first of all, that doesn't tell you how much more they should do. And secondly, it doesn't tell you how to deal with the possible clash between the two underlying principles. It is not obvious that those who have the greatest historical responsibility also have the greatest capacity to act. And in that case, what precisely is the trade-off? Effectively, the breakdown of the UNFCCC process in Copenhagen was all about this. As I'm No secrets here. This was in the newspapers. The breakdown was between the United States and China, and the breakdown was about one very simple question. China regards the principle of historical responsibility as overriding the principle of capacity to act, and the United States demands that the two be balanced. And because China is growing so fast, it has considerable capacity to act because the choices it makes now will make a massive difference to future emissions paths. Ethics can't quite resolve that question, which is a political question. It can help to understand the stakes and perhaps help to clarify the language. That's maybe as far as we can go. But the politics won't go away.
Quiero primero agradecer en nombre del Gobierno de la República Dominicana la invitación de UNESCO a esta conferencia.
He just would like to appreciate the invitation on behalf of the Dominican government to this event.
Muchas gracias, señorita.
Casi igual. Anda por ahí.
That's all I know. That's all I know.
Más o menos.
At least I got 2 out of 3 right.
You learn
Go ahead,
quick.
please.
Disculpa por el inglés, la parte hablada. Tema, quien les habla es el responsable de la Oficina de Cambio Climático del Consejo Nacional para el Cambio Climático de República Dominicana.
He is the person responsible for the Office of Climate Change within the National Council of Climate Change and Mecanismo de Desarrollo Limpio. What is it? CDM?
Clean development mechanism.
Clean Development
Yeah,
Mechanism.
okay.
El tema, mi pregunta o mi comentario es muy corto, porque en primer lugar el tema cambio climático resulta incomprensible para la mayoría de los tomadores de decisión.
His comment is very short, but he says the concept of climate change is incomprehensible or ununderstandable by those who make the decisions, political decisions or policy-related decisions.
Okay, yes.
Entonces, la parte ya agregada, si se quiere, con lo que tiene que ver con el concepto de ética en cuanto al tema, me temo que todavía va entonces a hacer que el trabajo sea más difícil.
He's worried that the topic of ethics is one of difficulty for those who make policy decisions within the government.
Entonces, estamos hablando de, en el caso de cambio climático, de informaciones incluso que nosotros no manejamos en la zona. Por ejemplo, lo que son los escenarios de cambio climático, la mayoría de nuestros países, Latinoamérica y el Caribe, tiene escenarios aún precarios que no conoce. O sea, los tomadores de decisión eso les resulta en incertidumbre.
Those who make the decisions don't exactly have all the information at hand, so they don't understand the models and consequently not necessarily can make decisions based on ethics regarding those policies.
Y las visiones éticas son distintas. Hay quienes apuestan a que habrá tecnología para resolver el problema.
So those who base their decisions on ethics are completely different. For example, those that have to do with technology also are entirely different.
Entonces, tenemos pendiente todos los temas vinculados a la convención, desde lo que son, por ejemplo, fondos de adaptación, los mercados de carbono, todo esto. Entonces, siento que, reitero, que es una carga muy grande para nuestros países entender aún más el problema.
So his comment is that it's difficult for countries such as ours to make decisions based on ethics when they don't have a complete grasp of all the implications related to climate change, especially within the ethical realm.
Yes.
In reference to carbon credits, in reference to the Green Fund,
Yes.
et cetera.
I somehow identify with your observation because I came into this meeting and it was the first time I was seeing ethics linked in with climate change and so on. I thought it's purely science. This is what happens. This is what it is. These are recommendations. And I'm opening my ears with, very wide as possible to see what is the input of ethics from the experts to see how ethics will shape the policy. But it's an interesting, very good observation.
I agree with both points. There are serious difficulties in adjusting the language of the various communities to each other so that they can talk productively to each other. This is what the IPCC was set up for, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and despite 23 years of hard work, there are still serious difficulties in discussing issues such as scientific uncertainty between scientists and policymakers. Because for scientists, uncertainty means something very technical, very simple, and very non-problematic, whereas for policymakers, uncertainty means they don't even know, so why am I listening? 23 years of IPCC work has only partly closed that gap, and it's a serious gap. So, I'm not sure that ethics is as difficult for two reasons. First, because the ethical framing of climate change is in the international legal agreements from the very start. They are about responsibility. And they're about responsibility for things that might happen. And responsibility for things that might happen is the core of one of the major branches of ethics. It's also the routine core of one of the major branches of law, incidentally, the law of liability. These aren't mysterious ideas. They're more difficult to apply to climate change because both agency and causality are dispersed. It's not clear who exactly is responsible, and it's not clear what exactly anyone in particular is responsible for. But we're still talking about fairly familiar ideas, which come down to the basic principle in most legal systems that if you broke something, you should either fix it or compensate the owner. And what ethics can do sometimes is cut through the complexities and remind us that some of the issues are more straightforward than they seem. On the other hand, ethical principles can clash. I mentioned the clash between two ethical principles, both of which are strongly enshrined in moral codes and legal systems. One, the principle of what would be called in English tort, that I just referred to. If you broke it, you should fix it, and if you can't fix it, you should compensate. And the principle that one should help those who need to be helped, whether or not one contributed in any way to their predicament. In many civil law systems in continental Europe, not only is there a moral duty to help someone who is in danger, it is actually an offense to fail to do so. In France, you can be prosecuted for failing to assist someone in danger. And this happens in the real world. It's not just theoretical. And those principles can clash. Ethics doesn't provide simple answers, but it can sometimes help clarify questions and take forward debate.
I just wanted to find out whether there is any consensus on the definition for the term climate resilience, because I know that there are many agencies using different terms for even among the UN agencies for resilience. So I just wanted to find out whether there is any consensus there.
Climate resilience.
The answer is no, there isn't. There is an ongoing debate about it. One of the reasons why there is a debate is that resilience is ultimately a psychological term, and adapting it to the performance of social systems is a bit tricky. Basically, the debate is about whether resilience defines... Resilience, let me start the sentence again. Resilience is basically adaptive coping by adapting. The question is, how much adaptation can you have before it ceases to be resilience and becomes transformation? Clearly, societies will not remain unchanged by climate change, and some of the changes can be good. That's one of the things I try to emphasize, or at least not uniformly bad. And therefore, the fact that resilience involves change does not necessarily mean that it is a form of enforced transformation. But how much transformation can you have before it stops being resilience and starts being someone else? Which is basically a psychological problem, which comes up in all therapy contexts. If the condition for being happy is to be someone else, then is that still you being happy, or is it simply an entirely different world? And the debates about resilience, which are much more technical than that, are precisely about the level of transformation that counts as part of resilience or that counts as going beyond resilience. And as far as I know, that debate hasn't been resolved at this stage. Take one example, which has been studied by UNESCO in its own social science programs. Is climate-driven migration necessarily a bad thing? Answer, no. It might be the most effective, cheapest, most humanly sustainable form of adaptation. But does it count as resilience? Or does it count as simply changing societies and people so that they can cope with climate change? That question remains unanswered. And indeed, when I said no, that's a controversial conclusion. There are some people who still believe that the primary objective of policy should be to prevent climate-driven migration. But there is a school of thought reflected in a forthcoming book by some of my colleagues in the social and human sciences sector that this is the wrong way of thinking about the issue, and that the challenge for the international community should rather be to permit and to give a clear basis for climate-driven migration. This controversy will continue.